Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I know that we have a national audience, so I don't know what the weather is like where you're joining us from, but in Boston, it's a beautiful spring day. I hope it is as nice weather wherever you are this evening. For anyone who may be attending a virtual MHS event for the first time, welcome. We are an independent nonprofit organization that maintains a research library with millions of pages of correspondence, documents, and printed materials for researchers of all types. Thanks to the support of our members, we are also able to host a wide variety of programs on topics related to Massachusetts and American history. Because of the support of our donors, we can offer our programs for free, and we keep our library open to the public. We hope that you'll return for future events, and if you enjoy our programs, we hope you'll consider supporting our work by becoming a member. This evening, we are joined by Professor Van Gosse for a talk on his book, The First Reconstruction, Black Politics in America from the Revolution to the Civil War. Professor Gosse teaches history at Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He is the author of numerous articles and books on post-1945 politics and social movements, including Where the Boys Are, Cuba, Cold War America, and the Making of a New Left. More recently, he has written on African-American politics in the antebellum era. He is also co-chair of Historians for Peace and Democracy. In his talk today, he will explore the history of African-American political participation before the Civil War. So without any further ado, Professor Gosse, if you'd like to join us, we can get the evening's discussion started.
It is a huge honor to be here at the Massachusetts Historical Society because of its foundational role in making history a practice in the United States. And it actually does have a direct connection with my book, because its founder, Jeremy Belknap, was one of the first people to actually notice that there was such a thing as Black politics, and I'll refer to that later. So I'm going to lead with what I call the big myth. It's not exactly a big lie, a big myth about voting in the early republic, which I see all the time, very often in progressive or liberal magazines like The Nation. And it basically goes like this, that in the early republic, from the founding on, only propertied white men could vote. This is repeated as like, thank God we've moved on beyond that. Only propertied white men could vote. Nothing about that is true. No part of that statement. Only men could vote. No, women voted in New Jersey. Substantial numbers of women voted in one of the original 13 states from 1776 to 1807. They were appealed to. Even some Black women voted in New Jersey. So put that aside, right? That only men with property could vote. That's the deeply held one. No, 5 states at least, including Massachusetts, had either de jure or de facto taxpayer suffrage from the founding on. And taxpayer suffrage is extremely minimal. You own a few tools and you pay the equivalent of $1 on them. It's a kind of low-level poll tax. It's not a property franchise at all. And that's at least 5 at the founding. Finally, and most pernicious, that only white men could vote. Now, this is not at all true. Only 3 of the original 13 states, Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia, put a racial qualifier in their constitutions. And when South Carolina tried to insert white into the Article of Confederation's definition of citizenship in 1778, it was overwhelmingly rebuffed. Indeed, when the delegates in the Massachusetts Constitutional Convention in 1778 submitted a draft constitution that limited voting to whites, they were sharply rebuffed by town meetings across the Bay State. And it was taken out, and that was the last attempt to disfranchise men of color in Massachusetts. And a popular outcry took it out. So now, there is no question that after 1790, most new states did legislate white suffrage, the new ones, and some of the older ones moved to disfranchisement. So that's part of the story. But you start from a position of mostly non-racial suffrage. So now I want to talk a bit about the historiography of this. When it comes to talking about Black voting, 1790, 1860, most historians have focused almost entirely on disfranchisement, which itself is strange if they weren't voting in the first place, if so few of them were voting, why were they disfranchised? My book argues they were disfranchised because they were voting in numbers significant enough to make a real difference. So at some point, in the same way that they would disfranchise immigrants or paupers, there would be an effort to drive them out for party advantage. But the net result of this focus on disfranchisement, it's in the textbooks, things like that, is to make Black men's participation in traditional American politics in these 70 years virtually non-existent or irrelevant. Now, the key text here is a great book, a foundational book, Leon Litwack's 1961, and it's in print now. Think of that, 60 years. Leon Litwack published North of Slavery, The Negro in the Free States, 60 years ago. It's a brilliant book, but in that book, he conceded that a tiny number of Black men in New England could vote. But he said, well, there were so few of them that it doesn't matter. And his book is still cited today. And obviously, I seek to overturn that emphatically. There weren't such a tiny number in New England. There were larger numbers elsewhere, which is a whole story of how they got the vote back in places like Ohio and New York. But, you know, it was that book, his Litwack book was extremely influential. I do need to give credit where credit is due. I'm building on a small but very powerful body of scholarship, often frankly ignored, but by really good historians. So Phyllis Fields, The Politics of Race in New York. In 1982, in the same year, Robert Cottrell published The Afro-Yankees, Providence's Black Community in Antebellum Era. 1989, William and Amy Lee Cheek published John Mercer Langston and the Fight for Black Freedom, which is about Ohio. In 2001, Catherine Grover brought out the tremendous Fugitives Gibraltar about New Bedford. And then my friend Steve Kantrowitz published More Than Freedom about Boston only a few years ago. And there's Bruce Laurie's Beyond Garrison. This is a substantial body of scholarship. But still, I will make the point that anyone who actually wants to go study Black politics in this period, party politics, voting, still has to rely on a master's thesis from the University of Wisconsin, which was defended in 1906 and published posthumously in 1912 by a man named Emil Olbrich. It's called The Development of Sentiment on Negro Suffrage 1860. It remains invaluable. This master's thesis from 1906, this tells you how little attention has been paid to this, to me, vital subject. Now, my book is primarily a series of case studies because I believe very strongly that you cannot study US politics prior to the Civil War, or really prior to Reconstruction, at any level other than at the level of the states. When you start talking about the North and the South, or the Midwest, or something like that, you immediately will get yourself in trouble because these states are in fact sovereign entities with distinct electoral structures and their own political cultures, all of which trace back to colonial times. So to actually study politics in this period, I think you have to look at the states. So that's what I do. But the book does begin, however, with a chapter, the only one that is about the nation, or the North maybe as a whole, a chapter on the shared ideology of vernacular Black republicanism, knowing how shifty that word republicanism is. And I do think that this is what linked together Black political activists across the whole North and some of them South, a sort of basic lingua franca, if you want, which began with a core English notion of birthright, which undergirded American citizenship. That if you were born on the soil, you were an English subject and you became an American citizen. So there's that. Orthodox Protestantism. I mean, these are, Methodists, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Baptists, Episcopalians, just as Christian, which meant Protestant, as the white people around them. Military service, many, many times evoked, especially in New England, which is where most of the Black men came from who fought for the Revolution, and straight up outright nativism. Not vicious, not violent, but definitely nativist. So the sub-theme of the book, the original title was We Are Americans, because dozens of Black men all over the North for decades said, we are Americans, and those Catholics who don't speak proper English or any English at all are not. So why are you discriminating against us? So that's part of their vernacular republicanism, which was especially effective in New England. because its premises were virtually all shared by a lot of Yankees, white Yankees. So the book has large sections on Pennsylvania, New York, and Ohio, but I'm not going to talk about those today. I'm going to focus on its New England section. The New England section has 3 case studies: Portland, New Bedford, and Providence. Each of those is a chapter, but those are preceded by a chapter which deals with the whole region, state by state, not lumping it together, between roughly the 1780s and 1830. So I'm going to talk about those chapters succinctly. But first, I want to lay out a series of premises that undergird my understanding of New England. First, I make a sharp distinction between what I choose to call upper and lower New England. Upper is Massachusetts and points north, lower is Connecticut and Rhode Island. These are distinguished by their political economies. Connecticut and Rhode Island are organized around the Long Island Sound with its own distinctive political economy linked to the West Indies. And Massachusetts and points north are much more Atlanticist, I would say. I mean, that's not my scholarship. In terms of the politics of race, it's a very sharp distinction. And here I need to refer to Joanne Mellish's extremely influential book, Disowning Slavery, Gradual Emancipation and Race in New England. And for good reason, it's become almost the definitive book that people cite. But, and I say this respectfully, there's a problem with Mellish's book from my point of view. It is mostly about lower New England. Most of her research, her examples come from Connecticut and Rhode Island, with their larger enslaved populations. It has actually very little to say about upper New England. And so, it's good for that, what it deals with. And then there are other parts of it that I simply don't agree with at all, and that's in my book. But it has been the thing that people refer to in the past 2 decades when they talk about race, politics, and enslavement in New England. So I want to say I respectfully differ, but specifically, I'm focusing on upper New England. Now, next, another point. There's a problem with all of the history of early America, maybe later America too, which is that historiography and public memory in New England are sharply skewed towards Greater Boston. Most of the books about New England, if you add it up, the things that people talk about that are remembered are actually Boston-centric. And the larger region, all those of the rest of it is kind of the periphery of Boston. Oh, interesting, the rest of New England. But the dynamic center and most of the scholarship that people have heard and read and cite, is Boston or the immediate environs. And this stems, this is true everywhere else, from historians' bias towards big states and large cities and presentist assumptions about small states' contemporary size, so-called small states. So the Pennsylvania history is dominated by Philadelphia and maybe Pittsburgh. New York history is, well, obviously dominated by New York City. So this is a general problem that I choose to refute. Now, to be clear, Massachusetts, in terms of population, at no point was Massachusetts ever dominant in New England. If you take the Maine district out, yes, it was part of Massachusetts constitutionally and legally until 1820. But in every other sense, it wasn't, all right? If you take out the Maine district, Massachusetts' share of the population in New England peaked at 3 in 8, 3/8 of the population of the region in 1790. By 1820, Massachusetts had less than 1/3, and that's all of Massachusetts, that's not even Boston. So there's actually nothing regionally dominant in terms of population. And indeed, by 1820, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine had just under half of the region's population. So this is where the presentism about New England comes in. New England may still register large in popular memory because of Thanksgiving, because of all the intellectual clout of Harvard and Boston and all that. But we all know that if you actually look at it politically, if you took away the senators, it would have almost nothing. You've got states with 1 member of Congress. Okay, this is not true in the period I'm describing. Vermont and the Maine district had been for 30 years among the fastest growing sections in population and economy of the entire United States. So in 1810, New England as a whole controlled 1/4 of the House of Representatives, 35 of 143 seats. Today, or the last time I counted in 2016, New England as a whole had 21 of 435. So think about that. From 1/4 to whatever tiny percentage 21 of 135 is, right? Vermont and the Maine district and New Hampshire, between them, sent 13 members to the House in that year. Vermont, Maine, and New Hampshire were 9% of the House of Representatives in the early in 1810 versus their 1% now. So why am I talking about this? If these are states where Black men voted and were politically visible, these were not tiny little quaint backwaters. They were states with real weight, and which they are not now, except for their senators. Okay, so that's one myth or problem. Here's one that gets right into the history. For as long as I can remember, historians have talked about and people have been told that the Garrisonian abolitionists, the Garrisonian wing of the abolitionist movement, were anti-political, that they abjured electoral politics and damned everybody and eventually became disunionist. Well, this is a facade, if you want. After 1840, the Garrisonians are actually fundamentally pro-Whig. They hate the Liberty Party so much that they go out of their way to attack the Liberty Party. And if you don't know what that is, that's all right. We'll get to it. In every instance, their objective politics, what they're pushing people towards, is supporting the Whigs. So I think that there's a lot of play acting about the Garrisonians that obscures what their actual partisan preferences are. And that's part of the book. Just to jump ahead, in 1844, Garrison sends Frederick Douglass and Charles Lennox Remond, who was then as famous as Douglass, to New Bedford to attack the Liberty Party. And it was charged, and I think they charged, to get votes for the Whigs, to hold Black voters for the Whigs. So this is sectarian, nasty politics, but it's important to kind of move away from myths about the Garrisonians. Now, another key premise, and this is, I'm just giving you the sort of larger shape of the book. I'm not the first person to point this out. In Massachusetts, Maine, and Vermont, for a very long time, until pretty close to the Civil War, there were constitutional requirements that you could not be elected without an actual majority of the voters. So you got 49.5%, you were not elected. And abolitionists, the Liberty Party, sometimes Garrisonians, used this to extraordinary effect to do what they called spoil elections by mobilizing their voters and mobilizing Black voters to go in and vote for the Liberty Party, or if you were a Garrisonian, just write in the name of somebody you respected, a white leader, or even a Black leader. And they were extremely effective. There were elections in which 80 House seats in the huge Massachusetts House, which is very large then and now, they couldn't fill 80 seats. 11 congressional districts in 1 year could not be filled because they would spoil them over and over. Why am I bringing this up? This gave real clout, real weight to small numbers of Black voters. Voting then was quite public. You walked up and people handed you a printed ballot. And anyone could see, they put them on different colored paper. You knew what a Liberty Party ballot looked like, what a Whig Party ballot or Democratic ballot looked like. Whose ballot did you take? So if Black men in any New England town went up and took a Whig ballot, they had sent a large message: stick with the Whigs. Elect a Whig, don't spoil. So this is part of how relatively small numbers of Black voters, through what I call the demonstration effect, had real clout. And this isn't me making this up. This, both in New England and elsewhere, this was repeatedly cited. Oh, look, the Black men had good sense. They went with this way or that way. They led the way for larger numbers of white voters. So, now I want to talk about the first chapter, and I'm probably going to spend quite a bit of time on that because it's sort of the framing chapter that looks at Black politics in New England from the Revolution, really the 1780s through 1830, before the case studies. It pays, actually, this chapter is the one that pays the most attention to Massachusetts and Black men's generally, not always, but generally their support for the Federalist Party, their distinct identity as a Federalist Party constituency. Now, to begin with, it's clear that by the 1790s, Black men were voting in all of the major port towns of New England, not just Boston. Jeremy Belknap, this is not an obscure quote at all. Notice that Prince Hall, the great Black Masonic leader and political leader, was leading his men to the polls in Boston in 1788 and was supporting the Federalists, in fact. But in fact, if you read the press, they are noted as voting all over the region, Salem and Newburyport, all the prosperous port towns. And the title of this chapter, to give you just a flavor of it, the title of the chapter is All the Black Men Vote for Mr. Otis. This comes from a 1798 congressional race where the Federalist Harrison Gray Otis, a great name in New England politics, an arch reactionary, defended his seat against the Republicans. And a New York newspaper quoted a Republican poll worker looking at a Black man voting for Otis, and he says to him, all the Black men vote for Mr. Otis. And the Black man says, yeah, and all the blackguards vote for the Republicans, for Mr. Heath. This is, of course, a play on word, blackguard meaning a low, contemptible person. Repeatedly, Republicans insisted that Federalists were hanging on to power, that Caleb Strong was reelected governor through Black votes. Now, may not be demonstrably true, but this was the charge again and again. There is a very famous diary from Salem, remembering that Salem at the end of that century was the #1 port in the US. This diary, as far as I know, it's cited all the time. Reverend William Bentley, a friend of Jefferson, a Jeffersonian, eventually chaplain of Congress. Well, he kept his diary for decades. He refers to Black voting over and over in this diary and how the Federalists somehow get all the Black votes. But Salem has a double meaning here that actually I want to bring it back even to the first slide that Gavin put up. Salem is the basis for the Remond family. Now, anybody who's paying attention to abolitionism in New England knows about Charles Lennox Remond. But really, it's his father who's the key figure here from my book. His father, John Remond, emigrated from Curacao in, I think, 1798. It's like a cabin boy. And John Remond became a political and economic power in Salem. He kept a restaurant and staged banquets that presidents, governors, senators came to. He was widely respected. He was given a major patronage position to control all of the chimney sweeping in the town in 1811. He was extremely prosperous. So he built a kind of a family dynasty there. And there was no question of his political weight. He was tied into Salem's Federalist elite, and he produces this outspoken, defiant abolitionist leader, Charles Lennox Remond. But there is a background here. So that's what this chapter focuses on. There's one point that is key, though. Jeffersonian Republicans in New England, but not elsewhere, complained about Black voting, but they never tried to disfranchise. They simply wouldn't go that far. It was not part of the political culture of New England to draw a color line. And what I refer to as the Yankee Republic was bipartisan. As part of its sectional nationalism, that's a term my friend David Waldstreicher invented. Its anti-Southern sectional nationalism was to be ostentatiously non-racial in public. I'm not talking about in private, but in terms of voting and public standing. In public, as voters, all men were equal. And if you were going to let poor men vote, degraded men vote, well, then you should let all of them vote, Black as well as white. That was the ethos of New England. And this comes to a head in the second stage of the Missouri crisis in 1820, the end of 1820, when a series of the most powerful political figures from Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine all speak up emphatically to denounce Missouri's attempt in its constitution to exclude Black and mulatto voters from their states. And what is striking about this, and this is my contribution to that historiography, is how deeply bipartisan it is. When you get William Eustis, the man who's going to finally kill the Federalist Party in Massachusetts in 1823, standing next to Harrison Gray Otis, the most reactionary Hartford Convention Federalist you could find, both of them saying, Black men have voted for me, Black men have voted for every representative from Massachusetts in this hall. They have just as many rights as white men. That's really impressive. And that is what the Yankee Republic looks like. And it's not just those two, it's Republicans and Federalists from across the region giving these extremely anti-racist speeches. And in particular, New Hampshire's arch Republican Senator David Morrill naming a series of prominent Black men, including Wentworth Cheswell of New Hampshire, who had been elected to every office in Rockingham County except state senator. That's the race he lost, but every other office since the Revolution on. A man of color, a yellow man, which is a perfectly polite term for a mulatto in those days. So this chapter, paying attention to the time, this big chapter on the region as a whole concludes by talking about the Massachusetts General Colored Association. And I suspect some of you on here know about this because it's the group that David Walker was identified with. But, and Walker, I mean, of course, Walker's an important figure, and I do talk about him. But I'm more interested in the cohort that he fit himself into that was already there in place when he arrived in Boston in 1826, if memory serves. This is an extraordinarily impressive group of elite hairdressers, caterers, cotillion band leaders, men who serve Boston's elite, who cut the hair of Harvard men. What is striking is normally when you think of patron-client relations between Black men and white men, that you expect to see subordination and deference. Nothing could be further. This elite group of Black men are shockingly defiant. They claim their rights. They talk with very publicly. They're covered in all the newspapers. They evoke Haiti. When they talk about the South, they say, well, you know, we will, in essence, we will stick a sword into the belly of slavery, and talk about Toussaint and Pétion and the great Black generals. So they're quite remarkably outspoken. And I find them very impressive. And I would suggest that the notorious abolition broadsides that many people have written about, including Walt Stryker, are actually focused on them, on the fact that they do march through the streets of Boston every year, authorized and protected by the select men to do so, and in uniforms. So abolition, those broadsides, are a response to this very aggressive, forthright, empowered political class. So that's that whole chapter, which covers the region as a whole and does actually talk about New Hampshire and Vermont and Western Mass, and less about Connecticut and Rhode Island, where there is a low-key but disfranchisement, Connecticut 1818, Rhode Island 1822. And so I've spent a lot of time on that because that gives you the whole region. I'm going to briefly touch on Maine, my chapter on Maine, which, you know, for obvious reasons, focuses on Portland. The way I see it is Portland, Maine, and Vermont probably could have had a sort of, you know, a healthy competition as to which one was more ostentatiously anti-slavery and ostentatiously non-racial in terms of its politics. But because it's quite a, the competition is very real. So here's an anecdote just to give you a sense. In 1854, Douglas writes from Maine. He's on his tour. He's always touring to raise money. And he talks about stopping off at a hotel and the former Whig governor of Maine seeing him and, you know, knows who he is or has met him before and says, oh, well, come and sit at my table and share my potatoes. And Douglas writes in his, in his newspaper, he says, a man's a man in Maine. So that's one example. And Samuel Ringgold Ward, another really key Black political leader, says exactly the same thing. Well, Maine is the place that is closest to Canada, where there is actual social and civil and political equality. So if we're talking about Black politics in Maine, we have to start with two figures who are not Black. The two most important Federalists in Maine, when it was the Maine District of Massachusetts, and then after, when federalism transmutes into national republicanism, and then Whiggery. And these are George Thatcher, the congressman from Maine from 1789 to 1801, and then General Samuel Fessenden. I focus on George Thatcher because as was pointed out a long time ago at various points, there is absolutely no equivalent in the 1790s to George Thatcher in Congress. He is the precursor of John Quincy Adams in the 1830s and 40s. He flays the Southerners. He hits them so hard with his denunciations of everything racial. He attempts the failed attempt to extend the Northwest Ordinance to everything south of the Ohio in 1797, which is a pivotal moment in American history. He gets 12 votes for it, 12 in the whole House, which is not great. So Thatcher's key, and he really is the continuity, the founder of Maine federalism, and he is an aggressive, almost intense anti-racialist. He's eventually the one congressman left standing in 1801 who votes to receive the petition, the famous petition from Absalom Jones from Philadelphia that is rejected to core. And Thatcher by himself stands and holds the floor and says, "I will be alone," and gets, James Forten. Some of you have heard of James Forten, the great gentleman of color of Philadelphia, writes him and says, "We are so grateful that there is one man who will defend us." So there's Thatcher. And where this comes to a head is, let me pull up my quote, is the Constitutional Convention of Maine in 1819. Thatcher is, by this point, he had been on the Massachusetts Supreme Court for 20 years. He is a very august figure. And one low-level Jeffersonian type tries to insert racial suffrage into the Maine Constitution, and he is shut down. He doesn't get anywhere with it. And finally, Thatcher gets up and says this, and I want to read this quote. And this is, he's clearly a figure of great probity. Someone says, "Well, what if one of the towns of Maine would actually send a black man to this convention, or a minor? What would we do?" And Thatcher says that it would be, and I quote, "It would be his duty to bail them," meaning to allow them in, "black or white, as brother conventioners. If a town had a black man in it, or could find one out of it whom they had rather confide their interest in than a white man, he did not think the convention had any right to exclude him on account of the color of his skin." And that captures Maine's non-racial politics. And the person who picks up that tradition is General Samuel Fessenden, the most eminent Federalist in Maine in the 18s, a militia general, a member of Congress, the state assembly. He has all these offices, who goes on to found the National Republican and then Whig parties in Maine. So Fessenden is fascinating because he is an outright Garrisonian abolitionist. He's the person who shows Garrison around Portland for the first time in 1832. He is constantly elected vice president of the New England Anti-Slavery Society, and he is a fierce and total National Republican and Whig until 1840, when he helps found the Liberty Party. But stop, why am I talking about these white men? Who is Fessenden linked to in the late 1820s and 1830s and after? He is linked to the most prominent Black abolitionist and leader in Portland, Maine, Reuben Ruby. Reuben Ruby. Now, to wrap this up, what is left out of people who've looked at Maine's politics, abolitionist politics, know these names. What is left out is that Reuben Ruby and General Fessenden went to the founding convention of the Whig Party in Maine in 1834 as delegates. So abolitionism in Maine is biracial. The Whig Party is biracial. And it's very hard to draw any distinction between them. And in Maine, people like Ruby, since the 1820s, have been getting patronage positions in Portland. Typically, they were appointed tithing men. Tithing men are the people who enforced the blue laws, made sure that no one sold liquor on Sundays. I'm not sure why this was reserved for Black men, but it was. So this is a tradition which extends from the 1820s into the 1850s of patronage positions, party positions, and party offices, and the consolidation of a significant Black voting bloc. So to wrap that piece up, so this is just to give you a flavor. In 1840, General Fessenden's son, William Pitt Fessenden, yes, the famous senator of the Civil War era, is elected to Congress. He defeats a Democrat from Portland because Maine has got lots of Democrats. And it is alleged in the national Democratic press and picked up all over the country that it was Negroes and abolitionists who defeated the Democratic representative Albert Johnson, and that William Pitt Fessenden was elected with Negro and abolitionist votes. And given how many votes there are in Ward 1 of Maine, that is on some level credible. I count the votes. It's a big chunk of votes in Ward 1 of Maine. So that's Maine's reputation. It's a place where Black men are visibly voting, are credited as a balance of power, where they're deeply tied into party establishments, and where they hold patronage positions. So now, I want to talk about New Bedford briefly. The title of my chapter on New Bedford, the second part of the title, the first part is a quote with a word in it that I will not say, calling it the Sebastopol, meaning Gibraltar, fortress of something. The second part of the title is Measuring Black Power in New Bedford, because I will argue that there is a significant degree of real Black political power in New Bedford, Massachusetts, for a long time, for a quarter century, and maybe later, but I stopped at the Civil War. It's worth noting, I mean, I talked about Portland. Portland is the lumber capital of the world in this period. It is shipping almost extraordinary amounts of out. It's a really dynamic place. New Bedford is the wealthiest city in America because of the whaling industry. It is not, these are not small old New England cities then. They are centers of the most dynamic, mercantile, sea-based capitalism imaginable. There seems to be a connection between that and, Black political power. So what distinguishes New Bedford over most other parts of the North is a and I didn't say multi-partisan competition for Black votes over decades, beginning in the 1830s. Whigs, Democrats, Liberty Men, Free Soilers, they all compete for Black votes. And perhaps as a result, there is genuine political autonomy for Black men. They go in and out of the different parties. Different Black leaders are in different parties, and it gives them, this is what leads to the greatest degree of actual political power and patronage. Patronage should always matter if we're measuring actual politics. From the mid-1830s on, Black men are engaging in the most modern form of partisan. They're questioning candidates and publishing the results, and that's how you get them to compete. Democrats want to show that they can be as supportive of Black rights as the Whigs in New Bedford, not in very many other places in the 1830s. Black men achieved significant internal party leadership, first in the Liberty Party in the 1840s, and then in the Free Soil Party from 1848 to 1854. In that latter period, they are simply all over party leadership. They are in every party committee, they're vice presidents, secretaries, they have a lot of. And at that point, the Free Soil Party, later sometimes called Free Democratic Party, is the third party, but it's a very powerful third party. It's competing for second place in that congressional district. And the apogee of this is the election of Rodney French, former Democrat, white man, is elected through an all-out mobilization of Black votes twice as mayor of New Bedford in 1853 and 1854. And it is extremely difficult to find anywhere in the North as outspoken a white political leader as Rodney French, the ex-Democrat, which is really surprising. So, but after that, the Republican Party comes along in New Bedford, as it does everywhere else in New England, as a much larger coalition than had ever existed before. And the fact that it is so much larger means that Black men's role in the party is necessarily smaller. They maintain party offices, some degree, some patronage, but they are not as prominent as they had been in the prior multi-party environment. So I will wrap up by talking about Providence. It's quite striking here to imagine that Providence and New Bedford are only, I measured it about 35 miles apart. Even then, that's not very far. And yet they could not be more different in terms of not simply the politics, but the entire position of African Americans in these two states, southeastern Massachusetts versus little tiny Rhode Island. African Americans in Providence had been really held in a severely subordinate position from colonial days through the revolution and after, subjected to all kinds of black laws and black codes, very late in developing their own institutions, a generation later than in other parts of New England. I mean, churches and communal societies. They, started trying to fight back in the late 1820s and 30s. But of course, the story of black politics in Rhode Island, as I'm sure some of my listeners know, is really the story of the Door War, the Door Rebellion, the all-white political insurgency, armed insurgency, led by the lawyer Thomas Wilson Dorr in the early 1840s. And the story is well told. I'm not, by no means the first person to describe the Door War and the paradox of black men regaining the franchise. Robert Cottrell did an excellent job on this, oh my goodness, almost 40 years ago, showing that in the all-out competition for power, sheer political power, the state's conservative law and order, so-called leadership, later the Whig Party, re-enfranchised black men too. I'll just boil it down, keep down the Irish. That is the essence of Rhode Island's politics from the early 1840s on, keeping down the Irish. Specifically, by enacting a very steep freehold property requirement for naturalized citizens to vote. Well, that actually keeps, as far as I know, and I've looked, can tell, that is not only fully relaxed until 1927. So I'm focusing on this. This is how black men fit into Rhode Island politics. The dominant political figure in Rhode Island from the 1840s through the 1870s is an extraordinarily reactionary nativist named Henry Bowen Anthony, publisher of the Providence Journal, later senator from the 1850s on. Senator Henry Bowen, Republican Senator Henry Bowen Anthony, held up the 15th Amendment, ratification of the 15th Amendment, because he was concerned that its stipulation that you could not use race to disfranchise would be used to enfranchise the Irish in Providence. And he received guarantees that it would not be used in this way, and he finally let the 15th Amendment go. So the really deeply reactionary merchant elite of Providence, unequivocally, and they said this many times from 1842 on, if they had to choose, they much preferred Negroes over Irish. They thought they were better workers, they were more fit to be voters, and most importantly, they had been loyal when loyalty really counts, when there was a kind of low-level civil war in the state in 1842. So this has been told before, and Cottrell emphasizes how the black vote was the balance of power through the Civil War. But what I want to conclude here looking at, is all of this revolves around a text, The Life of William J. Brown. People who really care about Black history in New England, you would know this book. This is, it's an oral history. It's quite clear because he was blind when it was published from a nursing home. And it's where he put it, one of Providence's richest men, put him into a nursing home after the Civil War. And he was blind, and he told his whole life story. It's extremely rich, and it's full of partisan politics, but it takes a lot of sorting out. So my contribution to this history is to go much deeper into William J. Brown's life. Everyone knows he was a Whig Party ward heeler, that he had a submachine and then he whipped it for the Whigs. But what I was able to tease out was that Brown's entire life, going back to the Revolution, was bound up with the state's elite. Even his name is not an accident. Moses Brown, Brown University. And that his political career reflected a larger pattern of deep patronage relations, which led up to the things that are better known, which is his mobilizing Black voters for the Whigs. So in my section on Providence, I talk about that, and I really do hit harder than anyone else the sort of Black over Irish element of this politics. But the last point, and then I'll be done. I mean, what Providence and Rhode Island really point out, which has to be stated very directly. And no, we should never assume that Black politics in this period is automatically anti-slavery or abolitionist politics. It isn't necessarily. It may just be politics. And this is made especially clear in Rhode Island because Douglas and other Black leaders repeatedly denounced Providence's substantial Black electorate, and it's not tiny, it's one of the larger ones, as being utterly faithless to the slave, as only just voting as Whigs. They will vote for anyone that the Whigs put up in 1844 and 1848. And in turn, Providence's Black Whigs who say, we are true Whigs, meaning we're party men, that's it, denounce Douglas. They say, who are you to come in here and try to make trouble for us? We're true Whigs. We're proud of being party men. We're loyal. We get, leave us alone. So I think that's worth noting that, if we're going to look at Black politics, we have to step away some of the time from assuming that it fits into the larger frame of abolitionism or anti-slavery. So that's a lot of my book, and I'll be really happy to take questions about that.
Well, thank you very much. It was a fascinating conversation, and I think it was probably eye-opening for a number of people. We do have a decent number of questions, although I would encourage anyone in the audience to submit a question using the Q&A function, and we'll get to as many of the questions as we can. So the first one that we had said, wasn't the Abyssinian Meeting House in Portland established in part because of the treatment of African Americans as second-class citizens in white houses of worship? What does this say about political/social integration on the ground in Portland beyond the electoral politics?
In Portland and in many other places, a distinction seems to have drawn between political spaces and social, or as in religious spaces. And of course, I've read Ruby's appeal in the Portland Journal, for funds that alludes to not being treated in a friendly way. So when Southern newspapers start denouncing General Fessenden and the National Republicans, this is the direct for fraternizing with Black men. They talk in great specific detail. And then Fessenden responds to how Black men march en masse into the mass meetings right before Election Day in 1832, are welcomed in and cheered into the banquet of the National Republican Party. And we know this is true because Fessenden actually replies and said, well, yes, we did welcome them because some of your people were here yelling at them and we wanted to know they were welcome. So there appears to be a sort of contrast between being welcome at partisan party events. I think that year or the next year, another one of the prominent Black leaders, who along with Ruby was a delegate to the National Republican Convention in Maine. Well, what could be more of a sign of respect than being an elected delegate from the city, the state's major city? I mean, these are facts. This isn't supposition. Not only does this man, James Bowes, is an elected delegate to the party convention, he also gives a speech at the Whig, festival in Portland. So I think the distinction between one space and another. Now, it is worth noting that when General Fessenden dies, or he may not have died yet, but very late in his life. Oh yes, I'm sorry. When Stephen Douglas, the little giant, probably the most effective racist politician in antebellum history, in Congress denounces William Pitt Fessenden as calling himself a Negro, saying he wants to be a Negro, something like that in 1854. He said, no, you're talking about my father. That's my father, but he was proud of being called a Negro. I know this sounds strange. And at that point, many people know, well, General Fessenden was famous for worshiping with Black people, for inviting them into his home, for visiting their homes. So the obvious point would be that some whites, Fessendens, were willing to do this, and others were not. Not enough of them in the regular congregational church. That would be my response.
Okay, great. So there's a question from Sarah who says, why do you think the myth of only propertied white men could vote gained and maintained such currency?
Because it feeds into a kind of comfortable liberal idea of progress. Well, things just gradually this and then that, one thing and another, one barrier, which is much more fun to teach and to repeat. Well, of course, it was like that then, but then we got rid of property requirements. And then the 15th Amendment came along, even if it wasn't enforced. And then the women could vote. And people, actually, especially liberal, educated, progressive people love to believe in progress. There is no such thing as progress or always regress in American history. It's both at the same time, all the same time. And to state the obvious, the really unfortunate, pernicious version of this myth of progress we saw in 2009, when all too many people, I count myself among them, thought that Barack Obama's stunning victory, the first majority for a Democrat since 1964, meant we had crossed the Rubicon to non-racial politics. I didn't believe that, but I thought it was a decisive change. And here we are now. Our politics are more racialized openly than they were before 2008. So the myth of progress, wanting to believe in it, is something that, and I'm going to say, educated liberal people seem extremely unwilling to give up. So that's why. That's my view.
Fair enough. Sounds reasonable. So an anonymous attendee said, did anti-racist quote, Yankee Republicanism emerge from the ideology of the American Revolution, or does it predate the revolution?
It's a great question. I go back, I toggled between anti and non-racial. And maybe the distinction is minor. I think it's more of a non-racial, like we're not going to acknowledge that. That's not that important. So let me get at the question. The historiography of this talks about Chief Justice Samuel Sewall back in, 1702, and maybe even Cotton Mather. There are, Cotton Mather evokes of one blood are all the nations of the earth, which is what the Bible says, and I believe. So there is a certain idea that you get from Sewall and Mather, and you forward and you get to John Brown. So there's a certain kind of fierce Puritan religiosity that, assumes that people are all sinners in the eyes of God, right? And that's part of the tradition, but that is by no means all of it. So, there's also just a straight up kind of, and this is the part that is really hard for people now to guess. There really is a straight, like, what do you mean race? Race? What? I mean, the people who study the idea of race point out that this was a very new idea in the 18th century. It was not something that had always been there. So I go back to Winthrop Jordan, White Over Black, when I came out when I was a tiny boy, right? That's a foundational book. He points that out, and I don't think he's been disproved. My particular contribution here is to focus on the word complexion. Complexion. The black men that I write about, the white men who are their allies throughout this entire period, repeatedly refer not to color or race, but to complexion. That's a very different word. Complexion could be because you are swarthy, a swarthy German, a swarthy Italian. It could be because you were out in the sun a lot. It could be because you drank a lot. Now, Black Dan Webster, the Black Dan reference is to severe marred by drunkenness, to put it bluntly. And I'm not the one who says this. Samuel Ringgold Ward, who is one of the key black leaders, gets enormous rises, like real roaring laughter out of a Boston audience in 1851, slamming Webster for the Fugitive Slave Act, because Webster was responsible. And he says, this is in my book. It's, back then they put the laughter into the transcription. He says, well, Black Dan, he better be careful over in Marshfield there, because someone might come for him. That's about complexion. So does Horace Mann in Congress. So there is actually part of the non-racialism that I talk about is actually saying, well, this is kind of a made up category. Look at what is white? What is black? What is red? Are red men actually as red as a British lobster back? Are black men actually black as night? I know this all sounds but that is the way a lot of the men that I write about talk about it. They make fun of. I'll give you one more example. When one of those, there are many of them, New England congressmen, people are denouncing the Missouri Constitution in 1820, it isn't just that they denounce using race. They say, well, what are they going to do? They're going to make anyone with red hair can't enter Missouri, which is a reference to Jefferson. Is anyone who's ugly or too tall or has a long nose will be barred? They're equating dark skin, not my dark skin, it's not, right? Being black with red hair. So that's part of the non-racialism. It's actually disdaining the notion of race itself, which feels so archaic now, does it not?
It does. It's hard to sort of think back on a earlier, better racial time, but I think that that's sort of a large part of what you're saying.
Yeah, it is actually, yes.
So Peter wrote, this was a wonderful talk on a fascinating topic. If you had a case study of another Massachusetts town or city other than New Bedford or Boston, what might it be?
Well, there's a lot on Salem sort of in that one chapter, but it's not a full study. Salem for sure, and Salem's a very, very important place. And I've got John Riemann, and then it's sort of I leave off there. I allude to Nantucket because there's been some good historical work on Nantucket, absolutely. And Nantucket is, it's umbilically connected to New Bedford. New Bedford is literally founded by Quakers coming over from Nantucket. I talk a lot about those Quakers, those families. That's really the story of New Bedford. So you could do Nantucket. That's a book right there. Another actual case study, I think Worcester might, there's evidence. I think Worcester has the first Black men formally jurying in 1859 or so. And there are allusions to voting in Worcester. And of course, John L. Brooke has an extraordinary book that deals with racial politics in Worcester, dense like mine. So I suspect Worcester would be worthy of a study. And I'll throw one more wild card in here in response, if I may. In that chapter that deals with all of New England 1830, I sketch, but with some depth, the rural politics. Black men are voting, visibly voting, and sometimes being elected or appointed to office across Western Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. But these are in rural counties. There is absolutely no question that the first Black state legislator in US history is Alexander Twilight, elected from Orleans County in 1836. And I'm quite firm on this. Everyone knew he was a man of color. There's nothing vague about it. He was also a very eminent man who had been the school teacher of most of Vermont's elite. But I wouldn't suggest a case study just of Orleans County. I think that there could be a case study of, Western Mass or rural Vermont. And that would be really interesting. And my stuff on this just builds on the excellent local scholarship. I don't do the work. Other people have done it, but at least I went and said, oh, look, you've done this work on Rockingham County in New Hampshire. So that's my best suggestion.
Great. Well, perhaps there's a person listening who's looking for a dissertation topic or next.
Oh, or Newport.
So Merrill wrote, and this may be the last question that we have, but do you think the position of Blacks in Providence is connected to the major role Providence, Bristol, Rhode Island played in the African slave trade?
That seems like a very good premise, and I wish I'd thought about that more. Yes. I'm not sure why Black Rhode Islanders were so much more subordinate. I just trace it out, like these laws, their children can be taken away. They can't they can't sell liquor. They're abused on the streets in a way that they would not have been in Portland or Salem for sure. That's in Life of William J. Brown. So I think actually maybe that might be why. I have to say sometimes, and I'm actually I was born in Providence. My dad was teaching at Brown in the 50s. It does seem to be, and I defer to others who know more, and an exceptionally conservative place in general until, like a kind of I mean, the fact that until the Boer War came along, they kept the Royal Charter as the basis for suffrage, the Royal Charter of 1664. There seemed to be a deep kind of, this is just how we do things and we're not going to change very much. So I'm sorry, that's not much of an answer. I think it's a good question to ask. I don't have much of an answer.
And I think that's very interesting. Certainly, I mean, Brown University was quite progressive in being one of the early schools to look at their connections to slavery.
Oh, yeah.
And it's interesting to think about that dynamic of them in a very conservative place, but being sort of one of the more progressive within the academy.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I want to be conscious of people's time. I know people have dinner plans and other plans. So I want to thank you very much for this presentation and for answering these questions. And any questions we didn't get to, we will pass on. If you are able to, there is a very generous 40% off discount offered by UNC Press. And this information is on the screen here, but we will also send it on to everyone with thanks for attending email that you should get in a day or two. So Professor Gosse, thank you very much. And
thank you.
I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Thanks a lot.